If someone had told me an apology could sound like policy changing, I'd have laughed. I'm Dr. Elena Mercer, and for the past 6 months I've watched my life's work swirl away like cold coffee down a drain. In conference room B, fluorescent lights carved unforgiving shadows across my research files while, outside, Chicago's winter wind rattled the medical center windows. My hands trembled as I aligned the neural pathway charts that represented 3 years of breakthrough research on treating traumatic brain injuries. Waiting. "She's here," whispered my colleague Miles Porter, his brown eyes soft with sympathy. "Good luck, Elena." The door opened with a sharp click of designer heels. Vivian Blake entered like she owned the building, which, considering her pharmaceutical investment firm basically funded half of it. Maybe she did. Blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. Blue eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Dr. Mercer." Her voice was ice cold. "Professional. I trust you understand why I'm here." "Budget cuts," I said, meeting her gaze. "You're here to decide which departments live and which die." A slight smile played at the corner of her mouth. How refreshingly direct. She sat across from me, opening her leather portfolio with deliberate precision. Her fingers were long, elegant, adorned with a single platinum ring that caught the light as she wrote. I found myself staring, then forced my attention back to my presentation. "Your neurology research shows promise," she said, not looking up from her notes. "But the return on investment is questionable." Return on investment? Heat flashed through me. "We're talking about human lives. We're talking about profit margins, Dr. Mercer. Emotional appeals won't save your funding." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to barely controlled fury. "Last month, we restored motor function to a 16-year-old who was told she'd never walk again. Is that worth anything to your spreadsheets?" For the first time, her professional mask slipped. Something flickered in those blue eyes gone too quickly to identify. "Show me the data." The next hour became a verbal chess match. She questioned every methodology, challenged each conclusion, dissected my research with surgical precision, but I noticed things. How her pen hesitated when I described patient victories. How her breathing changed when I showed brain scans of recovered trauma victims. How her eyes lingered on my face when she thought I wasn't watching. "Your patient outcomes are impressive," she admitted, finally closing her portfolio. But impressive doesn't guarantee funding." The room fell silent, except for the heating system's mechanical whisper. Miles had left an hour ago, smart enough to recognize a battlefield when he saw one. "Why do you do this?" I asked suddenly. "Excuse me?" "Decide who gets to continue saving lives and who doesn't. What made you choose that kind of power?" Her composure cracked like ice under pressure. "You don't know anything about my choices." "Then tell me." She stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady. "Your funding review will be completed by Friday." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting, Dr. Mercer." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Your research methodology in Section 4, the neural pathway mapping, it's brilliant." Before I could respond, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the echo of designer heels in the hallway. I sat alone in the conference room, staring at my scattered files. Something had happened in that room. Something beyond budget reviews and corporate protocols. The way she'd looked at me during those final moments suggested this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 3 days after our confrontation, I was drowning my sorrows in terrible hospital when Miles burst into my office. "You have to see this," he said, practically bouncing on his heels. "If it's another budget memo, I'm not interested." "It's not. Trust me." He dragged me 6 blocks through Chicago's bitter February wind to a converted warehouse in Fulton. The sign read, "Underground Grind," in faded lettering, but inside was pure magic. The space buzzed with energy, filled with the hiss of steam wands and the rich aroma of fresh espresso. "Latte art competition," Miles explained. "Winner takes 500 cash." I was about to protest when I saw her. Vivian Blake stood behind the gleaming espresso machine. Her usually perfect hair slightly mussed. Wearing jeans and a simple black sweater instead of her corporate armor. She moved with the same precision she'd shown in our meeting. But here it was transformed into something beautiful. "What the hell is she doing here?" I whispered, competing apparently. "And damn, she's good." I watched, mesmerized, as she steamed milk to the perfect temperature, her movements fluid and practiced. The foam she created was impossibly smooth, a canvas waiting for artistry. Then came the pour. A swan emerged in the cream-colored canvas of the latte, wings spread in elegant curves, neck arched with delicate precision. The crowd murmured appreciation. Even I, who couldn't make coffee without burning it, recognized mastery. Next, called the bearded judge. Without thinking, I stepped forward. I challenge her. The crowd turned. Vivian's eyes widened when she saw me, then narrowed dangerously. "Dr. Mercer," she said coolly. "This is unexpected. Life's full of surprises." The machine looked like alien technology. All chrome pipes and mysterious buttons. I'd watched Vivian's technique, but watching and doing were different species entirely. "Need help?" she asked, moving closer. "I'm fine." I wasn't fine. The milk scorched. The espresso pulled too fast. My attempt at a heart came out looking like roadkill. "Pathetic," someone muttered. Heat flooded my cheeks. But Vivian stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. "The milk temperature is everything. Listen to the steam." Her hand covered mine on the pitcher, guiding the movement. Her touch sent electricity up my arm that had nothing to do with caffeine. "Feel the rhythm," she murmured, her breath warm against my ear. Somehow impossibly, a flower bloomed in the foam, crude compared to her swan, but recognizable. The crowd applauded politely. Vivian won by acclamation, but she was looking at me with something unreadable in those blue eyes. "Beginner's luck," I said as the crowd dispersed. "Is that what we're calling it?" The warehouse was emptying, leaving us alone in the industrial space. The silence stretched, filled with unspoken questions. "Why are you here?" I finally asked. "Same reason you are, I suppose. Trying to find something real." "This is real to you." "Coffee art?" She began cleaning the machine with the same methodical care she'd shown in our meeting. "My grandmother owned a cafe in Evanston. I learned to pull shots before I could reach the counter." "What happened?" "She died. The cafe got sold. I went to business school instead of culinary arts." There was pain in her voice, carefully controlled, but unmistakable. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." It made me strong or cold. Her hand stilled on the steam wand. "Maybe both." We stood there in the dim warehouse. Two women who'd found something unexpected in the foam of overpriced coffee. The city lights filtered through grimy windows, casting strange shadows between us. "Your funding," she said suddenly. "Friday?" "You said Friday." "It's approved." My heart stopped. "What?" "Full funding for 18 months. Your research continues." "Why?" She finally looked at me. Really looked, and I saw something vulnerable beneath the corporate shell. "Because sometimes the smart investment isn't about money." Before I could respond, she gathered her things and headed for the door. "Vivian." She paused without turning. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet, Elena. This is just the beginning." The way she said my name, soft and intimate in the empty space, made my pulse quicken. Whatever game we were playing, the rules had just changed completely. The funding approval should have made everything perfect. Instead, it forged a volatile new current between Vivian and me. 2 weeks later, I was buried in patient files when my assistant knocked. "There's someone here to see you. Dr. Mercer says it's urgent." Vivian filled my doorway, not the composed executive I'd come to expect. Her usually immaculate hair was mussed, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "About what?" "The board meets tomorrow. They're questioning my decision about your funding." My stomach plummeted. "Are they going to reverse it?" "Not if I can stop it." She moved to the window, staring out at the Chicago skyline. "But there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that could end my career if anyone discovers why I really protected your research." The admission hung between us like a loaded weapon. I set my pen down with unsteady fingers. "Vivian, what are you saying?" She turned from the glass, blue eyes searing. "You know damn well what I'm saying, Elena." Hearing my first name in that soft, unguarded voice sent my pulse skittering. We'd been dancing around this for weeks, the tension ratcheting with every shared look, every accidental brush of skin. "This is complicated," I whispered. "Complicated doesn't begin to cover it." She stepped closer, her expensive perfume threading with the hospital's antiseptic tang. "I'm risking everything I built for you. I never asked you to. You didn't have to ask." The space between us crackled. I could see the flutter of her pulse at her throat, feel the heat radiating off her. The board suspects something, she went on, voice scarcely above a breath. Grant Whitaker, one of the senior partners, has been probing my sudden interest in neurology research. Let them ask, I said. You don't understand the stakes, Elena. These people destroy careers for sport. Her fear was unmistakable, but braided through it was something else, resolve, defiance. Then why risk it? I asked. She stepped nearer, close enough that the silver flecks in her blue irises caught the light. Because when I watched you present, when I heard the conviction in your voice about saving lives, I realized I haven't felt anything real in years. Vivian, I built walls, Elena. High ones. I thought they kept me safe, but they were a prison. Something inside me gave way. I lifted a hand, barely cupping her cheek. She closed her eyes at the touch, leaning into my palm. This could ruin us both, I murmured. Probably your reputation. My research. I know. And you're still here. She opened her eyes, meeting mine unflinchingly. I'm still here. The moment stretched, perilous and full of promise. Then she was moving in, I was pushing up from my chair, and suddenly there were only inches between us. Elena, she whispered my name, a prayer on her lips. The first touch of her mouth against mine was soft, hesitant, like she was asking permission. I answered by threading my fingers through her blonde hair, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, became something desperate and hungry. She tasted like coffee and mint, like expensive lipstick and forbidden desires. Her hands found my waist, pulling me against her with surprising strength. Every rational thought in my head screamed warnings, but my body had other ideas. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard. Her lipstick was smudged, her hair completely disheveled now. Damn, she breathed. My thoughts exactly. She looked at me with wonder, like she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. What are we doing? Something incredibly stupid and incredibly right. The truth of that statement scared me more than any corporate threat ever could. This woman with her ice-cold reputation and hidden vulnerability was becoming everything I hadn't known I wanted. The board meeting, I said, trying to return to reality. Let me handle the board. Her voice was stronger now, more confident. Whatever happens tomorrow, I won't let them destroy your work. And if they destroy you instead, she smiled, the expression transforming her entire face, then I'll have finally done something worth remembering. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. This changes everything, doesn't it? Everything, I agreed. After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, touching my lips where she had kissed me. Outside, Chicago continued its daily rhythm. But inside this sterile hospital room, my entire world had shifted on its axis. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tonight, I had the memory of Vivian Blake's mouth on mine, and the dangerous knowledge that some risks were worth taking. The board meeting went better than expected. Vivian emerged victorious, my funding secured for another year, but the victory came with a price I hadn't anticipated. Your girlfriend really went to bat for you, Miles said the next morning, his tone carefully neutral. She's not my girlfriend, right? That's why she threatened to pull her firm's entire investment portfolio if they touched your research. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Vivian had used her nuclear option, the threat that could never be taken back. She'd painted a target on both our backs. That evening, she called my personal number. My place, 8 o'clock. We need to talk. Her penthouse overlooked the Chicago River. All floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. She answered the door in jeans and a silk blouse, her hair loose around her shoulders. You shouldn't have threatened them, I said without preamble. Hello to you, too. She poured 2 glasses of wine, her movements precise despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. Vivian, I'm serious. You've made yourself a target. They were never going to leave us alone anyway. She handed me the wine, her fingers brushing mine. At least now they know the cost of coming after you. Oh, don't pretend you haven't thought about it. About this? She gestured between us, about what happens next. I had thought about it constantly. The kiss in my office had replayed in my mind for 24 hours straight. What happens next is complicated. Everything worthwhile is complicated. She moved to the window wall, the city lights reflecting in the glass behind her. In the soft lighting, she looked younger, more vulnerable than the corporate shark I'd first met. Miles thinks we're together, I said. Are we? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I sat down my wine and moved closer to her. I don't know what we are. Then let's figure it out. This time when she kissed me, there was nothing hesitant about it. Her mouth was warm and demanding, her hands tangling in my hair. I could taste the wine on her lips, could feel the rapid beating of her heart against my chest. Elena, she whispered against my throat, and the sound of my name and her voice made me weak. We moved together toward her bedroom, a slow dance of hesitation and desire. The space was as carefully curated as the rest of her apartment, but warmer somehow, more personal. Are you sure? She asked, her hands framing my face. Instead of answering with words, I began unbuttoning her silk blouse. Her skin was pale and perfect, granted only by a small scar near her collarbone. Car accident, she explained, following my gaze. When I was 22, scared the hell out of my grandmother. I traced the scar with my fingertip, and she shivered at the touch. It's beautiful. You're beautiful. The reverence in her voice undid me completely. When she pulled me down onto her bed, I went willingly, lost in the sensation of her hands on my skin, her mouth following paths that made me forget everything but her name. Later, wrapped in expensive sheets with her head on my shoulder, reality began to creep back in. This complicates everything, I said softly. I know, the hospital, your company, our careers. I know. Her voice was muffled against my shoulder. Do you regret it? I thought of her threats to the board, the way she'd risked everything to protect my work. I thought of the vulnerability she'd shown me, the walls she'd let down. No, I said honestly, I don't regret it. Good, because I meant what I said. This changes everything, and I'm not going back to pretending I don't feel something for you. Outside, Chicago glittered in the winter darkness. Inside this warm cocoon of silken skin, I was falling for a woman who could destroy my career with a single phone call. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the consequences. What happens tomorrow? I asked. She lifted her head to look at me, her blonde hair falling across her shoulder. Tomorrow, we learn to navigate this together. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to make this work. And if we can't, then at least we'll know we tried. Her optimism was infectious. Dangerous. I pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her expensive shampoo mixed with our shared passion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks. But tonight, in Vivian Blake's arms, I felt more alive than I had in years. Whatever the cost, this moment was worth it. The sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand reminded us both that the outside world was still waiting. Neither of us moved to answer it. Some things were more important than phone calls. 3 weeks of stolen moments, 3 weeks of secret lunches, coded text messages, and nights at Vivian's penthouse that left me dizzy with possibility. Then Grant Whitaker's ultimatum shattered everything. I know about you, too, he told Vivian during their morning meeting. End it or I expose everything to the hospital board and the state licensing committee. She told me this while pacing my apartment like a caged predator, her usually perfect composure cracked wide open. He has photos, Elena, of us leaving your building together. Of me at the hospital. Nothing explicit, but enough to raise questions. Let him ask questions. You don't understand. He's not just threatening exposure. He's threatening your medical license. The words hit like ice water. Everything I'd worked for, every patient I hoped to help hung in the balance. What does he want? My silence, my compliance. He wants me to sabotage the merger with Chicago General so his firm can swoop in and buy them for pennies. I stopped folding laundry and looked at her. You're not seriously considering it. I'm considering everything. Before I could respond, her phone buzzed. Her face went pale as she read the message. What? There's a protest downtown. Women's rights rally. Grant's people are spreading rumors that hospital executives are attending to cover their tracks on some discrimination scandal. The implication was clear. If we were seen there together, it would fuel the speculation. If we weren't, other people might get hurt by the lies. We have to go, I said. Elena, no. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than letting innocent people get caught in crossfire meant for us. An hour later, we stood in Hart Plaza among hundreds of women holding signs demanding equal pay and reproductive rights. The February wind cut through our coats, but the energy of the crowd was intoxicating. This is what matters, I told Vivian, watching a young woman speak passionately about workplace discrimination, not board games or corporate politics. She squeezed my gloved hand. You're right. That's when the police sirens started. The crowd began to disperse as officers moved in, but confusion reigned. Someone had called in a false bomb threat, probably Grant's people looking to create chaos. In the mayhem, Vivian and I got separated from the main group. This way, she called, tugging me toward a side street, only for us to slam straight into a police line. Officers were grabbing anyone who looked like a protester, cuffing first and asking nothing later. Wait, we weren't even, I began. Save it for the judge, an officer snapped, snapping handcuffs on us both. The holding cell at Chicago PD was a concrete box that reeked of disinfectant and desperation. We'd been there 4 hours before anyone bothered to explain why we'd been arrested. Unlawful assembly and disturbing the peace, the desk sergeant said with a shrug. Lawyers on the way. Now we sat shoulder to shoulder on a narrow bench, still in our protest clothes, watching other women get processed in and out. So much for keeping a low profile, Vivian said dryly. At least we're together, in jail. Details. She actually smiled. Only you would find a silver lining in getting arrested. Time crawled. We talked about everything and nothing, the kind of intimacy that only happens when every pretense has been stripped away. She told me about her first heartbreak, a college girlfriend who chose family approval over them. I told her about medical school's loneliness, about choosing career over connection for years. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone, she admitted as we huddled close on the unforgiving bench. What way? Like I'd rather be in jail with you than free without you. The confession hung between us in the hard fluorescent light. The detention center clattered on, but inside our small bubble, only truth remained. Grant was right about one thing, I said softly. What's that? This changes everything. Us being together complicates every professional decision we make. Are you having second thoughts? I looked at her, really looked. Her makeup was smudged. Her hair mussed from running. Her expensive clothes wrinkled from hours on this bench. She'd never looked more beautiful. The opposite. I said, I'm having first thoughts, real ones, about what I want my life to look like. And what do you want it to look like? Before I could answer, our lawyer arrived. Within an hour, we were released. Charges dropped due to lack of evidence and overcrowded cells. Outside on the courthouse steps, Chicago's winter twilight painted everything in shades of blue and gray. We stood together in the cold, breathing free air and processing what had happened. 8 hours in a cell, Vivian said. Not exactly how I planned to spend the day. Plans are overrated. Is that your professional medical opinion? That's my personal opinion about a lot of things. She moved closer, her breath visible in the cold air, such as maybe it's time to stop letting other people dictate our choices. The kiss we shared on those courthouse steps was soft, tentative, but filled with new resolve. When we broke apart, I saw something different in her eyes. Determination, decision. Grant Whitaker can go to hell, she said quietly. What about your career? What about yours? We stood there in the fading light. Two women who'd found something worth fighting for in the most unlikely place. The arrest had been random, chaotic, but it had also been clarifying. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. Grant Whitaker didn't waste time making good on his threats. Monday morning brought devastating news. My research funding had been mysteriously reassessed and suspended pending a full investigation into procedural irregularities. Miles found me staring at the official letter in disbelief. This is impossible, I said. The board approved everything just last month. It's not impossible if someone has enough influence to change minds. The truth hit like a physical blow. Vivian had betrayed me. Somehow, Grant had gotten to her, convinced her to sabotage my work rather than risk her own reputation. I stormed out of the hospital and drove straight to her office building, riding the elevator to the 42nd floor in a haze of fury and heartbreak. She's in a meeting, her assistant said nervously. Not anymore. I pushed past the protests and burst into the conference room where Vivian sat across from Grant Whitaker and two other suits. Her face went white when she saw me. Elena, this isn't a good time. Funny, it's a perfect time from where I'm standing. Grant smiled like a sharking blood. Dr. Mercer, how unfortunate about your funding situation. Cut the act, Grant. We both know you orchestrated this. I merely brought some irregularities to the board's attention. I turned to Vivian, who hadn't met my eyes since I'd entered, and you helped him do it. That's enough, she said quietly, standing. Gentlemen, we'll continue this discussion later. The men filed out, Grant, pausing to whisper something in Vivian's ear that made her jaw clench. When we were alone, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. How could you do this to me? I asked. You don't understand the position I'm in. The position you're in? My life's work just got destroyed because you couldn't stand up to corporate pressure. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple. You chose your career over us. Over me. Finally, she looked at me and I saw something desperate in her blue eyes. If I don't give him what he wants, he destroys both of us. This way, at least your license is safe. My license means nothing without my research. Your research means nothing if you can't practice medicine. The logic was airtight, and it still felt like betrayal. It reduced everything we'd shared, every intimate moment, every fragile connection, to a corporate equation. I trusted you, I said quietly. And I'm trying to protect what we have, what we had, she answered, voice fraying on the past tense. I turned to go, but her voice caught me mid-step. Don't walk away from this. From us? There is no us, I shot back. There's you guarding your reputation and me gathering the pieces. Even as I said it, I saw the pain in her face, the tremor in her hands as she reached for me. Elena, please. Something in her tone slipped past my anger. I saw her then. Not the corporate predator who'd crushed my future, but the woman who'd let me see her fears and wants. Tell me the truth, I said. All of it. It spilled out in a rush. Grant's ultimatum was worse than she'd let on. He didn't just want compliance. He wanted complete submission. If she didn't sabotage the merger and cut off my funding, he had evidence that could end our careers, and maybe land us in prison on fabricated fraud charges. He has connections everywhere, she said. Police, prosecutors, judges. He can make evidence appear or disappear. So you sacrificed my work to save us both? I sacrificed everything that mattered to me to keep you safe. The naked honesty in her voice unmade me. I saw the trap he'd set, the no-win corner he'd forced her into. Damn him, I breathed. Damn all of them. Then she was in my arms, and I was kissing her with 3 days of anger, heartbreak, and desperate love. She tasted like tears and coffee and the terror of losing what matters most. I'm sorry, she whispered against my mouth. I'm so damn sorry. I know. We made love on the leather couch in her office, Chicago unfurling beneath us through floor-to-ceiling glass. It was fierce and urgent, a claiming, a goodbye, and a promise in the same breath. Her hands traced me like she was memorizing a map, every curve, every response. When she touched me, I forgot everything but the electricity of her fingers on my skin. Afterward, wrapped together in her discarded blazer, we planned our counterattack. We can't beat him playing by his rules, I said. Then we changed the rules. How? She smiled. And for the first time in days, it reached her eyes. By giving him exactly what he wants, just not the way he expects it. The plan was simple in its audacity. Instead of fighting the investigation into my funding, we'd embrace it. Make it so public and transparent that Grant couldn't manipulate the outcome. Instead of hiding our relationship, we'd own it completely. It's career suicide, I pointed out. Maybe. Or maybe it's the beginning of something better. You're gambling everything on. Maybe I'm gambling everything on us. The words hung between us like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Outside Chicago pulsed with afternoon traffic and winter light. If we do this, there's no going back, I said. Good. I'm tired of going backward. Her mouth found mine again, sealing the pact we just made. Whatever came next, we'd face it together openly without apology. Grant Whitaker had tried to destroy us by forcing us into shadows. Instead, he'd pushed us into the light. Our plan to go public backfired in ways I never imagined. The Johns Hopkins offer arrived on Tuesday, delivered by overnight courier like a golden lifeline. Department head of neurology research, full funding, unlimited resources, and a 6-figure salary that would make my current position look like charity work. Take it, Miles said, reading over my shoulder. Get out of Chicago while you still can. But taking the job meant leaving Vivian behind, and after everything we'd been through, that felt impossible. I found her in her office that evening staring out at the Chicago skyline with an expression I couldn't read. You heard about Hopkins? I said, hard not to. Your friend Miles has been telling anyone who listened that you'd be crazy not to take it. What do you think? She turned from the window and I saw resignation in her blue eyes. I think you'd be crazy not to take it. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I can give you. The distance in her voice cut deeper than any argument could have. This was Vivian in full retreat, building walls to protect herself from another inevitable loss. Don't do that, I said. Do what? Push me away because you think it's what I want. Isn't it what you want? A chance to escape all this mess. I moved closer, but she stepped back, maintaining the space between us like armor. The mess includes us, I pointed out. Especially us. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Outside, Chicago's winter evening settled over the city in shades of gray and gold. You think I should go? I think you should do what's best for your career. And what about what's best for my life? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your life will be fine without me. Better probably. That's not your decision to make. It's exactly my decision to make, just like it was your decision to trust me and my decision to let Grant manipulate me into betraying that trust. The conversation was spiraling into familiar territory, the cycle of guilt and recrimination we'd been trapped in for weeks. Vivian, stop. Stop what? Stop pointing out that everything I touch turns to ash. Stop acknowledging that you deserve better than a woman who can't even protect the person she loves from corporate vultures. The word loves echoed between us like a gunshot. Neither of us had said it before, not directly, not in daylight, with full awareness of what it meant. You love me? I asked quietly. Her composure cracked. Of course I love you. That's what makes this so impossible. Loving someone isn't supposed to be impossible. It is when that someone could have a brilliant career 3 states away from all this dysfunction. I crossed the space between us before she could retreat further, taking her face in my hands. Listen to me very carefully. I don't want a brilliant career 3 states away. I want a life here with you, fighting whatever battles come next. Elena, together. Whatever Grant throws at us, whatever the hospital board decides, whatever happens to our reputations or our careers, together. Tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilled over. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying I choose you. I choose us. I choose this messy, complicated, sometimes impossible thing we've built together. Even if it means sacrificing Hopkins, especially if it means sacrificing Hopkins. The kiss was desperate, salty with tears and tasting of coffee and the future we were choosing together. When we broke apart, both of us were shaking. Are you sure? She whispered. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. That weekend, she took me to a place I'd never seen before. We drove north of Chicago to a small cemetery in Royal Oak. Snow covering the headstones like a pristine blanket. Beatrice Blake, I read from the granite grantaire. Your grandmother. I haven't been here since the funeral 5 years ago. We stood in the cold silence, our breath visible in the frigid air. Vivian placed a single white rose on the grave. I told her about you, she said softly. In my head anyway. Told her I found someone worth the risk. What do you think she'd say? She'd say, love is always worth the risk, even when it scares you senseless. The snow began falling then. Light flakes that caught in her blonde hair and melted on her cheeks. In that moment, standing in a cemetery talking to ghosts, everything felt possible. I pulled her close and kissed her soft and sure, tasting winter and promise and the salt of happy tears. I turned down Hopkins, I said against her lips. When this morning called them before I lost my nerve, she pulled back to look at me, her eyes wide with wonder and something that looked like profound relief. You're staying. I'm staying. Even without the research funding, we'll figure something out. We always do. The kiss we shared in that snowy cemetery was different from all the others. It wasn't desperate or hungry or born of crisis. It was a beginning, a promise, a declaration that whatever came next, we'd face it with open hearts and joined hands. When we finally made it back to my apartment, cold and snow-covered, but grinning like teenagers, I found a message from Miles on my voicemail. Elena, call me back. There's been an interesting development with Grant Whitaker. Something about federal investigators and questionable business practices. Seems our boy might have bigger problems than messing with hospital funding. I looked at Vivian, who was listening with growing amazement. Sometimes, she said softly, the universe has a sense of justice after all. Outside, Chicago slipped into its winter evening, but inside my warm apartment the future suddenly looked brighter than it had in months. Grant Whitaker's downfall arrived faster than either of us imagined. The FBI raided his offices on a Thursday morning while Vivian and I were drinking coffee at Underground Grind, trying to claw back a little normalcy from the chaos. Miles called, breathless. Wire fraud, tax evasion, and something about manipulating pharmaceutical stock prices. They arrested him an hour ago. I looked across our small table at Vivian and watched relief rise over her face like sunrise. It's over, she said softly. The criminal part, maybe. But we still have careers to rebuild. She reached for my hand, in plain view of the morning crowd. Simple, and radical for us. Then we rebuild them together. Within a week, my research funding was mysteriously restored. The investigation was quietly closed for procedural errors. Freed from Grant's shadow, Vivian's board began treating her like the asset she'd always been instead of a liability to be managed. But the real change was personal. I caught myself humming while I reviewed patient files, catching Vivian's eye across busy hospital corridors, leaving small gifts on her desk like a teenager nursing her first crush. She countered with flowers to my office and appearances at medical conferences she had no reason to attend, except to watch me present. You two are disgustingly happy, Miles observed one afternoon, eyeing Vivian as she stole a French fry from my cafeteria tray. Disgusting is probably the right word, I agreed, not caring who heard. 6 months later, as spring returned to Chicago and we started talking about moving in together, the revelation landed. I was working late when Vivian appeared in my doorway with takeout and a bottle of wine. Celebrating something? I asked. My resignation. The words hit like cold water. You're what? She set the food on my desk with ceremonial care. I quit the investment firm today. Effective immediately. Vivian, why? Everything was going so well. Everything was going according to plan. Their plan. Board meetings, profit margins, quarterly projections. I realized I was living someone else's definition of success. She came around behind my chair, her hands settling on my shoulders. What do you want to do instead? I asked. I want to open a practice with you. Combine my business skills with your medical expertise. Create something that actually makes a difference. The idea was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. That's completely insane, I said. The best ideas usually are. I turned in my chair to face her, seeing excitement and nervousness warring in her blue eyes. A joint practice. You handling business operations, me handling medical care. Exactly. We've been dancing around each other professionally for months. Time to dance together instead. The metaphor was perfect and completely like her, turning everything into elegant movement. What would we specialize in? Whatever you're passionate about, neurological rehabilitation, trauma recovery, research applications, the sky's is the limit when you're not beholden to corporate bureaucracy. I stood, moving close enough to see the flecks of silver in her eyes, to smell her familiar perfume mixed with the institutional scent of the hospital. This is crazy, I said. Crazy enough to work. Crazy enough to kiss you in my office where anyone could see. Now, that's the kind of crazy I can support. She was right. The kiss we shared in my sterile office, surrounded by medical journals and patient files, was the kind of crazy that made perfect sense. Her mouth was soft and sure, her hands gentle as they framed my face. When we broke apart, both of us were smiling. So, we're really doing this? I asked. We're really doing this. Mercer Neurological Associates has a nice ring to it. Blake Mercer. I corrected alphabetical order. Dr. Blake Mercer. I like the sound of that. The future unfolded before us like a map of unexplored territory. Our own practice, our own rules, our own definition of success measured in healed patients rather than profit margins. That night in Vivian's penthouse with Chicago glittering below us, we made love with a tenderness that felt like benediction. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a vow that this time we were building something that would last. I love you, she whispered against my throat as the city lights painted patterns on our skin. I love you, too. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything we'd been through, every risk we'd taken, every wall we'd torn down to reach this moment. Later, as she slept in my arms, I stared out at the Chicago skyline and thought about the strange journey that had brought us here. From professional adversaries to secret lovers to business partners, we'd traveled a road neither of us could have imagined. In the morning, we'd start planning our new venture. We'd deal with lawyers and licensing boards and insurance companies. We'd face the 1,000 practical details that turn dreams into reality. But tonight, in the quiet darkness with the woman I loved breathing softly beside me, I felt like we could accomplish anything. The future was ours to write, one page at a time. 1 year later, I stood in the lobby of our newly opened Blake Mercer Neurological Center, watching Vivian direct the installation of our custom reception desk with the same precision she'd once used to intimidate hospital boards. 2 into the left, she called to the movers, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her business suit replaced by jeans and a sweater that made her look younger, happier. Perfectionist, I said, moving to stand beside her. It has to be right. This is our American dream, Elena. Our first year had been a whirlwind of permits and inspections, loan applications, and insurance negotiations. But somehow, impossibly, we'd made it work. The practice was small, but growing. Our patient roster filled with referrals from doctors who'd heard about our innovative approach to neurological rehabilitation. 23 patients scheduled for next week, I reported, checking my tablet. And 3 research inquiries from universities wanting to partner with us. The success was intoxicating, but not as intoxicating as watching Vivian in her element. Building something that mattered instead of maximizing shareholder value. Dr. Mercer, our new receptionist, a young woman named Nora, approached with a clipboard. There's someone here to see you. Says it's personal. I looked up to see Miles standing in our lobby, grinning like he'd won the lottery. Miles, what are you doing here? Bringing news. The hospital board wants to offer you a consulting contract. Seems your innovative techniques are getting national attention. The irony was perfect. The same institution that had nearly destroyed my career now wanted to pay for my expertise. What do you think? Vivian asked quietly. I think we're too busy building our own future to look backward. Miles raised an eyebrow. You're turning down Chicago Medical. This could make your reputation. My reputation is just fine. Thanks. He looked between us, understanding dawning on his face. You're really happy, aren't you? Both of you. Disgustingly happy. I confirmed, echoing his words from months ago. Good. He hugged me briefly. You deserve it. After Miles left, Vivian and I walked through our small empire, checking treatment rooms and office spaces that still smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. Any regrets? She asked as we stood in my office, looking out at the Chicago skyline through windows that belonged completely to us. Only one? Her face fell slightly. What? I regret waiting so long to kiss you properly. Before she could respond, I pulled her close, kissing her with all the love and gratitude and wonder I felt for this impossible life we'd built together. She melted into me with a soft sigh, her arms circling my neck. We should probably lock the door, she murmured against my lips. Already did. Presumptuous, practical. Our laughter echoed in the small space as we fell together onto the couch I'd insisted on for late nights. Her hands were sure and knowing as they found the buttons of my shirt, her mouth tracing familiar paths across my skin. Later, curled together in the fading afternoon light, she traced lazy patterns on my shoulder. What are you thinking about? I asked. The future. Our future. Any specific plans? A few. Starting with dinner tonight. There's something I want to ask you. The mysterious tone in her voice made me curious. But before I could probe further, her phone buzzed with an appointment reminder. Mrs. Whitfield at 4, she said, checking the screen. Your stroke patient. Our stroke patient. This is a partnership, remember? How could I forget? That evening, she took me to Hart Plaza, the same place we'd been arrested during the protest that seemed like a lifetime ago. Snow was falling again. Chicago's winter settling over the city like a familiar blanket. Why here? I asked as we walked toward the riverfront. Because this is where I realized I'd rather be anywhere with you than somewhere safe without you. She stopped near the water, her cheeks pink from cold and something else. Nervousness maybe, or excitement. Elena, these past 2 years have been the most challenging and most rewarding of my life. Mine, too. We've built something incredible together. The practice, this relationship, this life that somehow works despite all the chaos. Vivian, what are you? She dropped to one knee in the snow, pulling a small velvet box from her pocket. Around us, Chicago continued its evening rhythm. But in this moment, the world had narrowed to just us. I'm asking you to marry me, to make this official, legal, permanent, to build the rest of our lives as deliberately as we built our practice. The ring was perfect, simple and elegant, catching the street lamp glow like bottled starlight. We can't, I said automatically. Illinois doesn't recognize. Illinois will catch up eventually, and when it does, we'll already be ready. She was right. The world was shifting, slow but certain, and we'd been on the right side of that change from the start. Is that a yes? She asked, still kneeling in the snow. That's a hell yes. The kiss we shared as she slid the ring onto my finger had only Chicago's winter skyline for an audience. It tasted like snow, coffee, and the future we were claiming together. Mrs. Blake Mercer, she murmured against my lips. Dr. Blake Mercer to you. Our laughter rang across the plaza as the snow kept falling, covering Chicago in clean white. In the distance, our clinic's lights glowed against the dark, a beacon for everything we'd built and everything still ahead. Some love stories begin with meet cuties and grand gestures. Ours began with corporate warfare and ended in quiet revolution, two women changing their corner of the world, one patient at a time. It wasn't the ending I'd planned, but it was infinitely better than anything I could have imagined.